So welcome everyone to Vancouver's Left-Wing Jews and the Politics of Respectability. Before we get started, just want to make one more note that this talk will be recorded and the lecture portion will be posted on our YouTube channel. You have the option to turn your camera off if you want to make sure that you don't appear in the recording. In order to encourage open discussion, the preliminary chat that we're going to have and the Q&A portion at the end will be edited out as much as possible. And the full video, though, may be shared with some of the students in the program who were not able to attend tonight. So my name is Adi Burton, and I'm one of the co-executive directors here at the Peretz Centre for Secular Jewish Culture. My co-facilitator, Michal Israeli, and I are hosting this event on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. This is the first talk in our new Doikayt Speaker Series, which is an extension of our new Doikayt educational program that this portion of it is open to the public. A couple of brief words about the seminar. So over 6 weeks in person, the cohort worked together to trace the histories of Jewish migration and settlement to the West Coast from 1880 through the 1930s. Through engaging with historical records and archival materials, we worked together to try to understand the role that Jews played in the colonial project of Canada and the political landscape of the emerging nation state, from railroad barons to bootleggers to radical labor organizers. This speaker series, like the Doikayt seminar, invites participants to revisit the familiar and close to home and reconsider the stories that we tell and the ones that we don't tell about who we are and how we got here. It's important to note that Jewish history in Canada is quite rarely discussed in the context of colonization and land theft, which is, of course, inseparable from where we are at the Peretz Centre and for most of our students and members. Through this program and other initiatives at the Peretz Centre, we try to work to uncover the specifics of colonization, its impact, and our implication in and responsibility for the places and peoples who inhabit them of where we live and come together in community. In our collective study and inquiry, we're indebted to the nations who have been the caretakers, custodians, and protectors of this land since time immemorial. In embarking on this learning journey, we are committing to the process of reconciliation and the decolonization of our narratives, historical memory, and practices, a process which is very much in progress. I'm particularly excited to introduce our speaker today to help us think about some of these things. Faith Jones, who is a librarian, translator, and researcher of Yiddish culture in Vancouver. She is a member of the Digital Yiddish Theater Project, which brings primary source material and accessible inquiry to the public sphere. Her book of translations of Shira Gorshman's stories, Meant to Be in Other Stories, was recently published by White Goat Press. She's a co-translator of The Acrobat from 2014, a selection of the poetry of Celia Dropkin, and she created super titles for the National Yiddish Theater Volksverein new production of Kadia Molodowski's genre-defying futuristic play. Faith, can you say it, please?
Alle Fenster zu der Sonne.
All windows face the sun. Thank you. So Faith's research on Yiddish language activism in Winnipeg and Vancouver has been published in scholarly journals. I really encourage you to check out her writings and in particular to take the opportunity to point you towards some of her excellent local work on local history, which is also shared in the resource list that was posted on the event page and shared by email with most of you. And in particular, her thesis on the Peretz Centre's Kierman Yiddish Library, which is where she is right now, a real treasure for our community. And I'll share the link to that thesis in the chat as I kick it off to Faith.
Well, thank you so much, Adi, and thank you to the Peretz Centre for hosting me and for inviting me to do this talk. It has been actually a very long time since I have revisited this question. I worked on it when I was doing my thesis for library school about this library, and then took a long break, and then this gave me an impetus to sort of rethink some of the things that I looked at in the past with regard to the way that the Jewish community interacted with the left. So I'm gonna do a couple of things tonight. I'm going to talk about the history of respectability politics in Jewish life, and if you don't know that term or you haven't heard the term respectability politics before, then it will become clear as we talk more about it. I'm going to talk then specifically about the Vancouver left and its relationship to the mainstream Jewish community. And I also then am going to talk a little bit about the contemporary situation that we find ourselves in now for left-wing Jews in Vancouver. All of that's going to take probably 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will have plenty of time for conversation together. So I've also given you the resource list. I hope everybody has received that. I'll be referring to it throughout my talk. And there's, obviously I had to choose. I was trying to save trees because I thought I'd be printing it out for people in person, not realizing that we were online. So there's plenty more on this topic, and I can always help people find more if they have a particular interest, and I'm happy to do that. So, starting out with a background on Jewish respectability politics. We tend to think of, in terms of the left, we tend to think of this really starting with the Cold War. This is not true. Long before the Cold War, Jewish immigrant communities in New World locations around the world formed a habit of what's often called obeying in advance, specifically policing the activities of other Jews. And the most common structure used in order to ensure that Jews were behaving in a way that made Jews look good was a committee. There is nothing more Jewish than a committee. And why is that? Why was a committee needed to police other Jews? Well, it's because I think Jewish culture has always required a kind of localized social organization. It's not like a Christian denomination. There's no pope to sort of tell you what to do. So there isn't really a professionalized body that makes decisions about who is and who isn't a good Jew. That's something the community does to itself. So to ensure compliance with religious imperatives, committees did that kind of thing. If we think about a Gemilas Chesed or a Chevra Kedisha, the bodies that worked on charity or burials, these were always done through volunteer committees. So a volunteer committee, which enforces certain kinds of behavior on Jews, seems very natural. And these things, of course, do still exist in the Orthodox world. And in addition, I think because Jews don't proselytize to non-Jews, committee work is oriented inward. And so making a Jewish committee to control individual Jews' actions is normalized. So in the New World, we see secular self-policing committees start to emerge. And committees have advantages in the political sphere. Committees can be joined by prominent Jews could join these committees. Leaders or advisors to the committees could help it gain legitimacy. And so then it could serve as the Jewish voice in official communication with governments and media agencies. So the history of Jewish committees in general, in one way, could be turned towards this specific goal of making Jews respectable members of democratic societies where Jews started to live when they migrated from the Old World. I want to point out that all of the early examples of self-policing that I have found within immigrant Jewish communities were not policing of political boundaries. They were policing of sexual boundaries. So one of the most prominent examples would be how Jews in Argentina attempted to manage what they perceived as the crisis of prostitution. From the 1910s to the 1940s particularly, there were frequently trafficked Jewish women trafficked by other Jews to Buenos Aires for work in brothels. And this was a cause of great unease among the sort of respectable elements of the community. And this was not usually because of the effect of trafficking on trafficked individuals, but because of the effect of those trafficked individuals on the image of the moral and upright, respectable Jews. So where there were numerous groups in Argentina that sought to prove that prostitution was not primarily a Jewish business, which was indeed true, but it ignores the fact that Jews were overrepresented in prostitution within the sex trade generally, both as sex workers and as pimps and procurers. They were still a minority, but much larger than they should have been given their percentage of the population in Argentina. So what happened in Argentina specifically was that there eventually emerged this thing called the Jewish Association for the Protection of Girls and Women, and it was given the official governmental duty of deciding which Jewish women could marry or immigrate through a system of morality certificates. So needless to say, once you are policing prostitutes, you are actually policing all women, because all Jewish women, because any Jewish woman is potentially a prostitute. I have to say, just as an aside, I have no evidence about prostitution of people who weren't women. I have never read anything about that, so I have to leave that to the side for now. And if you're interested in learning more about this particular chapter in Jewish history, on the resource list, you'll find a book chapter by Mir Yarfitz that follows this story. The Jewish community in Argentina also organized anti-prostitution groups that, among other things, attempted to cleanse the Yiddish theater of pimps and prostitutes. And there are some articles and books about those efforts. I have left those off the resource list because I think they further stigmatize prostitution and sex work. I think the work of those committees was often very harmful to sex workers. So I haven't provided those, but they do exist, and there is quite a lot of information in them, even if we disagree with the viewpoint. A second example of this kind of sexual policing of Jewish bodies, and usually Jewish women, was this very bizarre progressive era New York emergence of the investigation of shop girls. Shop girls meaning just any woman who worked in a store. And shop girls were investigated by, Jewish shop girls were investigated by other Jews as to whether or not they were of high moral character. Why shop girls in particular? First of all, because immigrant women in general were seen as being naive, delicate, in need of protection, but also corruptible and unable to contain their base sexual and deviant desires. So these two things existed at the same time. It doesn't make sense. That's just the way it was. They saw women as having this divided character, and immigrant women in particular. And so if immigrant women went to work in stores, they were particularly corruptible because they were in the public view. They might be required to speak to men that they don't know, some of whom might not be Jewish, some of them might not even be white. And they came into contact with luxury goods, and that would elicit in them material desires for those goods, which could actually only be fulfilled through consorting with men. So shop girls then inhabited everything that was worrying about immigrant women. And as a result, the Jewish owner of Macy's, Percy Strauss, identified numerous Jewish employees of his own that he investigated and scrutinized for almost a year, and he worked with and reported to several civic organizations to cleanse the image of his own store as only employing women who were of a high moral character while leaving intact their assumptions regarding the inherent moral corruptibility of immigrant women. And the absolutely fascinating article about this is on your list. It's by Val Marie Johnson. In the history of self-policing, we find that sometimes a committee could be dispensed with if a particular high-profile Jew could motivate the power of the state to act instead of it being purely an internal battle within the Jewish community. And the most famous example of this is the God of Vengeance trial. Quick recap for anybody who's not familiar with God of Vengeance. This was a very popular Yiddish play by Sholem Asch, which had been mounted in New York several times in Yiddish, and off-Broadway it had been mounted in English. In this play, there's a Jewish brothel owner. He is punished for his sins of running a brothel when his own daughter falls in love with one of the prostitutes and herself enters prostitution so that they can be together. When this play received its first Broadway production in 1923, a prominent rabbi, Joseph Silverman of Temple Emmanuel, which might still be the largest synagogue in New York, it's absolutely enormous, Silverman contacted his close friend, the district attorney, and asked for charges to be laid against the producer of God of Vengeance on the basis that it was anti-Semitic. The idea of it showing a brothel owner as a Jew, he considered that to be anti-Semitic. However, the eventual charge that was brought against the play made the opposite case, not that it was anti-Semitic, but that it was actually too Jewish in its portrayal of sexual deviance, which clearly stood in opposition to Christian morality. The producer was found guilty, and the production was halted for some time. So in this case, the rabbi got his wish of stopping the performance of the play, but by doing that, he set in motion further anti-Semitic rhetoric in the courts and in the press. And we don't really know if Rabbi Silverman regretted opening that can of worms. And there's an article by Harley Erdman on your list if you want to continue to look into that. So that's some of the history of early Jewish policing that I've found, self-policing that I've found in New World communities among immigrant groups, among immigrant Jews. So I want to talk a little bit specifically about what happened in Vancouver with the Jewish left in Vancouver. So this is the sexual and moral repression sort of preceded the in-group repression of the left. There were always debates about which politics was most desirable, but there wasn't really a mechanism for the actual suppression of Jewish left-wing thought until we sort of get into the Cold War. So I'm just going to be talking about Vancouver. There's other interesting things to be said about other places, but Vancouver is what I know the best, so I'm mostly just going to be talking about Vancouver. And I'm going to be drawing heavily on my article called Between Suspicion and Censure. It's on the resource list. But since I wrote that paper, which was almost 30 years ago, I've developed a much greater sense of how that story fits with the pieces I just spoke about and also fits with our current situation. So if you do read the article, you'll find it mostly about facts, but not as much analysis as I'm offering tonight. Vancouver's Jewish community grew enormously during and immediately following World War II. It almost doubled from between the 1941 and the 1951 censuses. So it went from about 2,800 people in 1941 to about 5,400 people in 1951. And most of this influx was internal immigrants from other parts of Canada, or secondary immigration of American Jews to Canada, or the re-immigration of previous immigrants who had come to Canada, moved away, and then moved back. And because of these migration patterns, the majority of Vancouver's Jewish community were either born in Canada or had lived a significant portion of their lives in North America. So Holocaust survivors, just to make sure you understand, tended to come quite a bit later, sort of into the later 50s and the 60s. So as a result of this big influx of Jews and the rather sudden emergence of a larger Jewish community, splits began to form within the community, and it branched into religious, political, and social affiliations in a number of different ways. And it's in this context that both the United Jewish People's Order Vancouver chapter and the Vancouver Peretz Centre were formed. In 1945, the UJPO, United Jewish People's Order, was established in a number of major cities across Canada, and that included a chapter in Vancouver. The UJPO was a communist-aligned group. It ran social and political events attended by the wider Jewish community, but always with an eye towards communist ideals. The Vancouver UJPO included a number of transplants from other parts of Canada who had union organizing experience, which was important and useful because Vancouver always had a very small working class, Jewish working class. So there wasn't as much union organizing experience here as in other parts of Canada, and so it was useful to have those people here. And what's useful especially about union organizers is that they're used to working across political lines. So the Vancouver UJPO followed this framework. Shortly after forming, the UJPO held a community meeting to determine if there was interest in forming a school and how it should be organized. And as a result of both the specific skills of the UJPO members and the consultations with the broader community, the Vancouver Peretz Schule was established. The Peretz School took a broad view of progressive Jewish life while specifically promoting a secular connection to Jewish tradition, Yiddish culture, and intercultural collaboration and understanding. These were the central values of the organization, and I believe they still are in many ways. The initial community reception to the school was quite warm, and the Peretz Centre was treated as a constituent member of the mainstream Jewish community. This was not the case in Toronto and Montreal, but in Vancouver, as well as some other cities, the UJPO and the Peretz Centre were integrated. They had representation on boards and committees. They participated in community-wide activities. They received financial and practical support from Jewish groups and businesses. And it was no secret that 3 of the founding board members of the Peretz Centre were also members of the Communist Party. UJPO members, not all of whom were Communist Party members, were for decades among the most active participants in the Peretz Centre. Although there were some early signs that the Jewish community wanted to cleanse itself of the association of Jews with communism, none of the UJPO or Peretz Centre activities aroused any concerns in the mainstream Jewish community until quite suddenly in 1952. In 1952, the Canadian Jewish Congress embarked on a communist cleansing activity from within its ranks. It instructed the 4 regional branches to each expel the UJPO. The UJPO had been in conflict with the Canadian Jewish Congress for some time, and the necessary push for eliminating it, which I'm sure was a great relief to the CJC, seems to have arisen from the awareness of the witch hunts that were well underway in the US and were underway in Canada in a different way, more covert, but still devastating as anti-communism spread in Canada. I would recommend, for more on that history, both the book and the video, The Un-Canadians. The RCMP is known to have contacted organizations to warn them off any affiliation with communists or communist-related organizations, and this may have happened in the case of the CJC. There isn't a clear record of exactly why the CJC chose this moment or exactly why they chose this tactic to get rid of the UJPO, with whom they were frequently in conflict, but they may have received direct RCMP instruction. Of the 4 Canadian Jewish Congress branches, 3 complied quickly and expelled the UJPO by executive vote, whereas the Pacific branch opened the matter up to membership debate. Thus, the first attempt to oust the UJPO from the Pacific branch of Canadian Jewish Congress was unsuccessful, and that was partly because a number of right-wing free speech advocates were opposed to it. They still held on to that part of their ideals. And in addition, although the growth of the Jewish population in Vancouver and across the Pacific region had allowed for a greater diversity of organizations and viewpoints within the Jewish community here, it was still small enough that people had family and personal ties across political divisions. So the Pacific branch did not expel the UJPO. At that point, the national executive stepped in and overrode the community vote. They expelled the Vancouver UJPO from Congress. This actually did very little to change the standing of the UJPO within the community. They continued its activities. In many ways, nothing much had changed for them. But then in early 1953, they invited the prominent Canadian communist Joe Gershman to speak against Zionism, and probably also, this is a little bit less clear, probably also against the mainstream Jewish community's lackluster response to the rearmament of Germany. So this was a frequent source of criticism of Jewish leadership that, specifically by communist Jews, that they had not opposed the rearmament of Germany in a forceful enough way. In what I think is the most Orwellian moment in this entire history, the Jewish Western Bulletin, which was the official mouthpiece of the Vancouver Jewish Administrative Council. I know there's a lot of organizations in here, and I'm going through them, and several of them changed names several times throughout this. Just don't worry too much about the names. But the Jewish Western Bulletin was the magazine, the newspaper that was published by the Vancouver Jewish Administrative Council. So they wrote a long editorial about its decision to allow the UJPO to publicize their upcoming Joe Gershman event. And they said this was a matter of principle. They were in favor of free speech. They honored the diversity of viewpoints within the community. These were their guiding principles. They declared this publicly in print. And this matter stood for 5 weeks until the Vancouver Jewish Administrative Council also expelled the UJPO. And then the UJPO was now not allowed to place notices in the newspaper or to publicize their events. So after the UJPO was expelled from various parts of the mainstream community, the Peretz Centre became the next target. And the Peretz Centre was, of course, somewhat larger and somewhat more diverse, but nonetheless, it was informed it could not take part in the United Jewish Appeal. This is the major annual fundraising activity of the Jewish community. It's an important moment to be able to raise funds. And it appears that for both the UJPO and the Peretz Centre, it was the Vancouver Zionist organization, along with Congress, that were central in orchestrating the alienation of the left from the mainstream community. In their published statements on this matter, the Vancouver Zionist organization began using a rhetorical pattern that you will probably find familiar, but at the time it was still being developed. It was really a new way of identifying how they were going to justify expelling certain Jews from the Jewish community. So first, they would name a group as having heinous political beliefs, such as support for the Soviet Union or anti-Zionism. Then they would invoke the supposed unanimity of all other Jews, or the most important Jews, or the most Jewish Jews, and so they would say that everybody else is against these beliefs. And then they would identify the people who espouse those beliefs as failed Jews, as anti-Semitic Jews, and finally, as non-Jews. So I'm just going to read you, it's a bit lengthy, but I'm going to read you this quote from the Vancouver Zionist Organization. It appeared in the Jewish Western Bulletin, March 19th, 1953. The attitude of the UJPO and its sympathizers towards Israel and the Zionist movement being inimical and tending to bring into disrepute the ideals and principles of the Zionist movement, as well as the leading Jewish personalities of our time, we are compelled to publicly declare our feelings of indignation and contempt that any professing Jew should espouse or condone the actions of the Soviet government within the borders of Russia and her satellite states. So far as we are concerned, the persons who subscribe to this malicious and anti-Jewish thesis cannot be considered from our point of view as members of the Jewish community. We feel it our duty to expose and denounce all those persons, regardless of who they may be, whose beliefs and conduct are subversive, dangerous, and damaging to the interests and self-respect of the Jewish community, the Zionist movement, and to the State of Israel. So I hope you followed that sleight of hand where it went from we're opposed to these beliefs to these people aren't really Jews. Follows the pattern. Over the following, yes, people are responding to that one. I see the emoticons coming up. Over the following decades, the Peretz Centre and the UJPO experienced an up and down relationship with the mainstream Jewish organizations. It's too much for me to go into. If you want to read the paper I wrote about it, you can find more details there. Sometimes they were allowed to participate in the United Jewish Appeal, although they started getting a very, very small allocation. Sometimes they were allowed to publish in the Jewish Western Bulletin. Sometimes they were allowed to write opinion pieces because that was freedom of the press, but not to publicize events. Sometimes they could not appear in the pages at all. And in a truly, truly mean-spirited exchange in 1982, the Jewish Community Fund and Council, so that's one of the names this body went by over the many years. So in 1982, this Jewish Community Fund and Council declined to assist the Peretz Centre in its property tax fight, which the Peretz Centre has to pay taxes because it's not a religious organization. And instead, it advised the Peretz Centre to sell the building and then give the proceeds from the sale of the building to the Jewish Community Fund in repayment of grants that it had received over the years. These were, they were grants. Grants do not have to be repaid. That is the nature of grants. So that was their proposal for how to solve the Peretz Centre's problem of back taxes that it owed for quite a number of years. And in terms of the Canadian Jewish Council, I believe the UJPO was reinstated, but it might have been quite brief in the 90s. I'm not entirely sure. I don't believe they are currently members. I don't know. There might be a UJPO member on this talk who can tell us more about it in the Q&A. And I should mention that I have found one piece of evidence that not just organizations but individuals were also voluntarily blacklisted by mainstream Jewish organizations. And that is in the book I mentioned earlier, The Un-Canadians, Hank Rosenthal, who many people who are online here might remember Hank, who was the editor of Canadian Jewish Outlook until his death in 1998, before Carl Rosenberg took over from him. So Hank once applied for a job with B'nai B'rith Canada, and he was asked if he had ever belonged to an un-American activities group. So I can only assume that this happened to various people. I don't have any other evidence of blacklist of individuals within the Jewish community. There is certainly lots of evidence that there were blacklists through governmental agencies of communists, many of whom were Jewish, in Canada, but within the Jewish community, I just have that one data point. So I want to make one more comment about this kind of voluntary policing within the Jewish spaces in the Cold War era before we move on to the present day. What happened in Vancouver was not unique. There were similar in-group pressure in the United States with the development of the American Jewish League Against Communism, founded by a Southern rabbi, which had close relationships with McCarthy himself. It also happened in South Africa and in Australia, and you can find more about that in the resource list. It is perhaps most shocking that this occurred in countries that didn't have specific anti-communist laws or public bodies the way the US did, but I think it is less so if we consider those histories within the history of white supremacy and colonialism that shapes our national consciousness, which demands conformity to white gentility and punishes groups that maintain non-conforming social and political identities. So let us now talk a little bit about our contemporary experience of as left-wing Jews in Vancouver. And there are probably a number of people here with us tonight who have experienced deja vu just now through the things I've been describing, the tactics that many of us have personally experienced within the Jewish community. And to find that these things have roots that are at least 70 years old can be a little bit stunning. In some ways, as Jews, and I think as a culture in total, we are still living in the Cold War. So the question for me is, how do we experience ourselves as left-wing Jews in Vancouver? It's my feeling that we're in as bad a place right now as we were in the 1950s. The mainstream community again seeks to create barriers for us to participate in community and even to be seen as Jews. And it's important to notice that it doesn't matter the ways in which we enact our Judaism or Jewishness, or how we promote or create Jewish culture, or the ways in which we inculcate Judaism or Jewishness in the children we raise or educate, whether in our homes, in synagogues or minyans, or here at the Peretz Centre. Left-wing Jews are decidedly personas non grata in numerous settings in Vancouver right now. And I'd like to give you two examples of local experiences that show how the left is continually forced into a defensive posture within the Jewish community. This part's a little bit painful. Many of you know that a few years ago, the Peretz Centre had a board that decided to take the organization in a different direction from its historical mandate. With absolutely no community consultation, they hired a mainstream Zionist executive director and threw the organization into Zionist programming with funding from Zionist organizations. None of this is within the Articles of Incorporation of the Peretz Centre, and it had the potential to undermine the nonprofit status of the organization. Many attempts at conversation about this direction were unsuccessful. I myself reached out numerous times and had 2 meetings with the executive director, which were polite and yielded 0 results. This situation came to a head after October 7th, 2023, when the board sent out a message endorsing the IDF. They seemingly didn't realize that the organization they were leading was in severe disagreement with their new positioning. The assumption made by the board was that the people who were most like themselves were the majority, and the loudmouth leftists like myself were in the minority. Because every other Jewish organization was releasing a statement in support of Israel, they felt the need to do the same, again, ensuring that they looked as normal as possible to mainstream Jewish organizations. In fact, we can see how being part of the mainstream was so important to those board members that they could not identify what was needed for the health of the organization they were running. We did successfully organize to retake our Peretz Centre as a progressive space, offering members the ability to articulate anti-Zionist and non-religious expressions of Jewishness if they wished to do so. It took organizing and a lot of effort by the last 3 boards, for which I am grateful, and I would encourage all of us not to take the Peretz Centre for granted. Another example is the decision by the JCC to refuse entrance to people wearing a keffiyeh. They justify this decision in a number of ways: that it is not a religious symbol, so not protected by law, that it is frightening to people to use the JCC who believe they will be targeted by a person wearing a keffiyeh, and that any individual is allowed in if they just take off their keffiyeh and hide it away from sight. As a 60-year-old queer person, I am old enough to remember when being gay was absolutely fine as long as you never mentioned it. And this happened a lot in Jewish spaces. Mentioning sexuality was equated to explicit discussion of sex, which we must not do in polite company because we are, say it with me, respectable. We are respectable members of society. Respectability therefore demanded effacing a central part of our identity, and it is this which makes me so angry when a Jew cannot wear a keffiyeh to enact their identity as an anti-Zionist. And I am here talking about the stigmatization within the Jewish community. I believe the stigmatization of the keffiyeh has other meanings when it is non-Jewish people who are wearing it, and especially Palestinians. I've been considering a lot lately how the stigmatization of clothing in particular is used throughout self-policing activities, whether they're about the left or whether they're about sexuality, sex workers, or all kinds of different ways that clothing becomes a proxy for respectability. For example, the traditional limitations on Jewish clothing that uphold rigid gender separation and prevent the appearance of any uncouthly masculine women or embarrassingly feminine men. banishing the kafia, in particular, attempts to erase Palestinian identity in accordance with the Zionist talking point that there is no such group as Palestinians. And I've been thinking lately about the keffiyeh wearing Jew as perhaps the queerest symbol in the anti-Zionist resistance, hugely embarrassing and disruptive to the normative discourse that Jewish organizations require for their political standing. Because we have to keep in mind that what respectability politics is serving is the pursuit of political power. So I think I have been talking for long enough for right now. What I would like to do at this point is to hear some other voices. And the first thing I would like to do is offer space for anybody who identifies as a left-wing Jew. If anything I've said has brought up any thoughts or feelings that you want to share, I'm very happy to hear about those ideas, and we can then after that move on to a general Q&A. I realize that some of the things I've said may have been triggering for people or upsetting, and I'm sorry if that's the case. And then we'll have general conversation, and then I'll have some concluding remarks. So just to conclude, and thank you so much to everybody for this incredible conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and I've learned a lot too. So just to conclude our conversation today, I wanted to talk to you about self-policing and respectability politics. Self-policing can be understood as part of this historical process in which Jews are reaching for something. What are they reaching for? They're reaching for whiteness. They're reaching for respectability. And through those things, they're hoping to gain safety and political power. Respectability is always about power. And I'm going to read a definition of respectability politics by Margot Daisy. This is on your resource list. It is defined as an inherently ambivalent political strategy, one that stands at the crossroads of forms of resistance and accommodation of oppressive structures. So this is the thing that we continue to see in our own community. And I don't believe the Jewish community is ever going to stop policing itself. I think the best thing we can do is to create the alternative structures that serve us better, like the Peretz Centre, like the UJPO, like other organizations across Canada. And I also think we have to think about how respectability politics might play out within the left. And we have to ensure that we don't reproduce that kind of harm. The left itself has its own problematic and complicated history of things like homophobia and transphobia. So we should consider how we can inhabit a truly radical politics of inclusion. So in closing, I just want to say thank you to all of you. I'm grateful for the stories that you've shared, and I hope that the things we've talked about tonight can help us navigate the situation we're in a little bit better. As I've mentioned, I'm not a political scientist, but I always feel that history helps us make the decisions that we need to make in the present day. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Faith. We're so lucky to have you in our community and to learn so much from you. Please, everybody, thank you also for participating. It's really nice to be in this space with you virtually. Hopefully we can be in person in spaces as well. And in particular at the Peretz Centre. Coming up, we have a lot of great events happening this weekend. There's a wonderful art show featuring several of our community members. We have on Sunday, the first Kinderwelt story time for kids. We have Klez Jam, where we're looking for musicians to learn the wedding repertoire for our 80th anniversary gala, which is going to be quite wonderful. And we also
And dancing.
and dancing, yes. And this weekend, there's also dancing on Sunday. If you would like to learn Yiddish dance, thank you, Sunny, for putting that in the chat, the link to the event. And there's really a lot of things happening. Please keep an eye out, check out the newsletter, look at our website, follow us on Instagram where we post most things, but not all of them. So thank you everybody for participating, and we will see you next time.